Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Troubadour Talks. Today, we are going to be talking about Oedipus Rex, or as it's known in the English, Oedipus the King. And to discuss this with us, I have Timothy Sandefur on the program with us. So thank you very much for joining us, Timothy. And do you mind if do you prefer Timothy or Tim?
Tim is fine.
Tim is fine. Okay. So Tim is the vice president of litigation at the Goldwater Institute. And also, particularly, and I read some of your bios, you are interested in the in ancient Greek plays, but also how law and litigation worked in that time, and in Star Trek, I saw. So you're interested in how law has worked throughout the ages, and even in certain science fiction realms as well. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. The literature very often is about what makes politics legitimate, what makes the state legitimate or morally justified. And in all of literature to this day, I think there are very few that can compare with the Orestia Trilogy by Aeschylus, which is a series of plays that climaxes in the creation of law. Really, the climactic moment of the third play, the Eumenides, is where Athena creates the legal system in Athens as a resolution of the system of vengeance, the cycle of vengeance that is begun by the initial murder in the first play. And I've always thought that was really a fascinating way for lawyers to consider what is it that makes the legal system legitimate? Well, the answer to that is the Constitution. Well, what makes the Constitution legitimate? And the answer to that involves questions of morality, of lots of complicated philosophical details that I think are really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think so. Right before we jump into Oedipus and how that all works together, just so everybody knows, you can go visit and read the articles of Tim Sandefur if you go to sandefur.typepad.com. That's SANDEFUR.typepad.com. And he has written articles on lots of different topics, including law, but also liberty. Frederick Douglass, you have a book on Frederick. So lots of things, but go there and you could search through a lot of the articles. And I think there's a wide ranging of things that we can, that he's an expert on and very knowledgeable about. And law, of course, is probably the primary one, I would imagine. And, so just going back to what you were just saying, I think I wanted to add that I think I agree with you about Aeschylus and the Orestia. It's actually how it was introduced to me when I studied ancient Greek is read the Orestia. It's kind of this, the progression of, like you're saying, going from this vengeance world, which you see in later literature as well. You see that type of thing in Shakespearean, theater. And there's a lot of that tension that you get in literature where there's a kind of origin, but I don't think it's as poignant for me anyway, as it is in the Greek, because they were really interested in theater as helping the individual viewer, audience member, be a better person and a better citizen. And so they were grappling with these really complex, difficult issues. Sometimes today in modern times, we would definitely not agree with them, but the idea that they took it so seriously, I think, is really important, and that it was an art that would lead to this kind of understanding, this realization, what Aristotle called a catharsis. And I think that, maybe can lead us into Oedipus, which is, just so people are a little clear in how we can position this, Aeschylus is the first of the three major tragedians. Then it's Sophocles, then Euripides, and Aristophanes, the comedian, is thrown in there somewhere. And Aeschylus wrote the Orestia, which is three plays. I think it's what the libation bearers, it's the Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides, right? And then Sophocles wrote the Theban plays, which is where the Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King is situated. It's Oedipus the King, Antigone, and Oedipus at Colonus. And those are kind of the trilogy, although we could talk about what a trilogy is in another sense. We like trilogies today, but the Greeks had a different view of, I think, the importance of the trio. But anyway, so with Oedipus, we have this story that's really well known in Greek, and I think it's well known today. So when we approach Oedipus, we approach it with a keen knowledge, even today, of at least the major things that happened, right? Like we all probably today, and the Greeks definitely had the audience members in 5th century Athens were really knowledgeable about, the Oedipus leaving Corinth because he was fleeing from a oracle that predicted he was going to kill his father and sleep with his mother. He approaches the Sphinx, which is a monstrous figure that people in Thebes were sacrificing, and people on this crossroads, I guess, were sacrificing in order to, if they couldn't answer this riddle, which nobody could. And the riddle was, what's the riddle? What
walks on 2 legs in the morning? No, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? Yeah.
And he answers that. He solves the riddle, which I'll wait on that in a second, say what that is. He gets to he gets to a crossroads. He kills a man who's in the way of the crossroads. He gets to Thebes. There's no king there, so he becomes the leader of the Theban people. He marries the wife, or he marries the queen, becomes the king, and then that is actually what happens before Oedipus the King, the play opens. So why don't you get started and tell us a little bit about what you think the play in specific is about?
Well, yeah. So, and you're right that people would have come to the theater with this knowledge of the background. I like to analogize it to the Marvel movies nowadays, where people come to the theater knowing who Batman is, knowing the backstory of Batman. That does not, however, prevent the writers of the movie from kind of fiddling with it. They come up with reboots, or they come up with new twists on how to tell the origin story. And so then you get like competing versions of Batman's backstory, or Spider-Man, or whatever. And the Greek tragedians tended to do that. They did kind of fiddle with these mythologies a little bit, so that nowadays, you'll open up a Greek mythology textbook and it'll often say, well, according to some sources, this happened. According to some other sources, that happened. Well, the reason why is because the Greeks sometimes kind of retold these stories to make broader points as they explored moral issues. So what happens with Oedipus is it begins kind of in media res, as they say, in the middle of things. It starts with the Thebes has been subjected to a plague. People are dying mysteriously, and it's been going on for some time. And the citizens are gathering in front of the palace, crying out for Oedipus to do something, because he's a great leader. He's a wise man. They know that he can do something if he puts his mind to it. He comes out of the palace and says, "Don't worry, I'm on top of it. I've sent to the oracle at Delphi to tell us what's going on here, and we'll get this problem solved." And all this. Well, when the oracle returns, it turns out that according to Apollo, the reason for the plague is because Thebes is harboring a terrible crime, and Oedipus sees it as his task to solve this crime in order to appease the gods and put an end to the plague. Meanwhile, the famous blind soothsayer Tiresias arrives to tell Oedipus that there's something going on here and it involves you, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because Oedipus is kind of this brash, somewhat disrespectful fellow. And he says, "Oh, well, I don't need to listen to superstitious nonsense from you." And Tiresias says, "You'll find out soon enough that you are the cause of this problem." Oedipus, and this is kind of an interesting thing that Sophocles does here. Oedipus responds to this by saying that Tiresias has been paid for by Creon, who's kind of his political rival. He's the brother of Jocasta, who is Oedipus's wife, and later we discover his mother. And Oedipus accuses Creon of having paid off Tiresias as sort of a trick to gain power. And Creon says, "Well, what are you talking about? Why in the world would I do this? You have no reason to suspect me." The reason I find that interesting is because Sophocles does a very similar thing in the Antigone. In that play, he also has, by that time the king is Creon, Creon starts to become suspicious in the same way and accuse his rivals of being bought and paid for. And it seems to be a theme in Sophocles' writing about kings that they tend to be really suspicious and always expect that other people are conspiring against them, even when there's no real reason to do so. It's kind of revealing about Sophocles' view of political power. Anyway,
Yeah.
as the play continues, the clues start to pile up. Oedipus starts to investigate. He brings in a messenger arrives and says, "Hey, guess what? I've just got news. The king of
Corinth.
the king of
Corinth.
Corinth.
Corinth,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say colonist. Anyway,
Yeah.
the king of Corinth is dead. And this is actually good news to Oedipus, because you were supposed to kill that king, and it turns out you didn't. He died of natural causes, so everything's okay. Well, then, of course, it turns out that the king of Corinth is not actually his father after all. He was adopted. He was, and as the clues fall into place, Oedipus discovers that actually it really was true that he was actually born in Corinth. That that the man that he killed at the crossroads on the way to Thebes was actually his father, King Laius. That Jocasta actually is his mother, and all these things fall into place when the truth is revealed. Oedipus, or Jocasta rather, hangs herself inside the palace. Oedipus, upon discovering her body, plucks out his eyes with the pins that she uses to hold her dress on, and then begs the new king, Creon, to banish him and put an end to the misery of Thebes. So it's the reason why the great scholars like Aristotle regarded it as such a well-written play was primarily because the way the clues are revealed in the play very sequentially, the audience can really appreciate the truth dawning upon Oedipus as he discovers very slowly that all the avenues are closed off and he can't avoid the truth, and it's right there in front of him, and how horrible it is. And it really worked quite effectively when it's done well.
Yeah, and in rereading it, I haven't read it in years, and I reread it this last weekend, and I was struck again, and I remember this in the past, but I think even more, just the universality of the play and how it applies much more today than I would have even anticipated. If you just replace the blind seer with people who make broad projections today about the future, right? Whether it's climate models or economic models or all these types of things, there's just so much you can see about these seers and whether we listen to them, how we listen to them, why we ignore them, why we agree with them and take them at their word. And these are things that I think the Athenians were grappling with in terms of, this society at this time, when they're writing this in the 5th century, which is, Athens at its classical almost its golden age, that it's, they're really interested in how to establish a good society, what kind of leaders that they want to have, and maybe the pitfalls of that. And and we can go into the moral issues. That's just kind of the political issues. But I found it very interesting because, like you said, the first thing that the king says about this Tiresias character, the blind seer, who says that knowledge rests within me, right? I mean, how many climate modelists and economists say essentially this is the truth about what's going to happen in the future, or and there's or political pundits say that the truth rests within me in a sense, and that they're projecting or predicting some horrible outcome or some wonderful outcome or whatever it is in the future. And
well, I think Sophocles has Oedipus be so skeptical toward Tiresias because of that sense of paranoia and suspicion. Incidentally, what you say about trusting authorities and so forth, this comes up later in the play when Jocasta has several lines where she says, "Oh, who listens to soothsayers and oracles and that sort of thing anyway?" And Sophocles has her proven horribly wrong, right? It turns out that the oracle is right and that Tiresias has been right all along. And I think the way Sophocles approaches it is, I think, more religiously conservative. Now, I don't think Sophocles is as much of a conservative in a cultural sense, as some scholars do. There's this long-standing tradition that Sophocles is this sort of mild, religiously conservative guy who sees his plays as proving to the world why the gods are just or something. And I don't think that can always be reconciled. Certainly not with the Antigone, but so I don't think that's always true. But I do think in Oedipus there's a certain tendency by the characters to rebel against the idea that the world is ordained by the gods. And I want to hasten to say, I don't think this is a tragic flaw. The concept of tragic flaw has been used to interpret tragedies for a very long time. And I remember when I first read this play in high school, my class was basically assigned to figure out what Oedipus's tragic flaw is. And the tragic flaw is the idea that this character is, maybe great, but he has this one little failing and it's going to lead to his ultimate doom. And I think that's anachronistic. I don't think that the Greek tragedians had the idea of tragic flaw or used it that often. The most obvious candidate for a tragic flaw in this play would be hubris, right? Mm-hmm. Hubris is the ancient Greek concept of trying to rise above your station, or to be like a god when you're really immortal, or that sort of thing. And there is hubris in this play, no question about that. But I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, Oedipus is punished for his hubris. I don't think that's the case. Oedipus is punished for mythological reasons. He's punished because Apollo decreed that he would be punished as in response to something his father did. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing Oedipus can do to escape that. And I remember in my high school class, when we first read this play, being very outraged by that. The students were all very bothered by the idea that Oedipus does his very best to avoid committing the sins which he ends up committing. And it seems terribly unjust, terribly unfair to punish Oedipus in this way. To which the answer, I think the correct answer is, this is not a play about justice. It just isn't. This is a play about freedom. Mm-hmm. This is a play about how free are we really in a metaphysical sense. Free will, freedom of choice. And I think that this ties in with the riddle of the Sphinx, actually. And to put this in sort of broad terms, the way I would describe it is, I think that people, and I think this is particularly true of ambitious and intelligent people, sometimes it's easy to forget that you are a mortal being, a physical body that will in the end decay and pass away and never be seen again. We live so much in the world of ideas and dreams and values and abstractions that I think it's easy to try and it's easy to think that is what you really are. There's a line in a James Taylor song where he says I try to give up my body and live in my mind. Mm. And Oedipus, I think, does that. I think what he tends to do is he sort of rises to a level where he's living in a world of ideas as opposed to a world of mortality. And what ends up happening is that he gets brought down by the gods in the end. And that's why the incest part is part of the play, is because it's part of this physicality, the fact that you can't avoid being a biological creature for everything else. So there is hubris in it, but I don't think that it's as simple as Oedipus is punished for his hubris. It's a question about all of humanity and our tendency to sometimes, imagine that we are just spirits rather than that we are a fully integrated being, if that makes any sense. It's a kind of a rough way of putting it, but I think you can see what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So there's a couple points there. One, the tragic flaw thing, I agree with. I think a lot of this comes from Aristotle and his whole concept of missing the mark, and that he had a lot of prescriptive things to say, which from then on, whenever people read Aristotle, especially since he's such a powerful thinker, they would sometimes just take it all literally and just say, that's the end, right? So this tragic flaw thing, I do think from a literary, especially like high school and junior high type readers, the problem with it is that it can be an interesting way to enter the text, but it should not be the ending of your interpretation and analysis.
Right.
It should just be like something to, okay, so maybe there is some hubris, but let's go further into it. And I think there's a flaw in that literary analysis that sometimes gets in the way. And I wanted to touch on something you talking about these characters and talking about, I agree with you with the theme has to do, if not is, about fate and free will, particularly what free will and freedom is allowed within this fatalistic world that we live in according to the Greeks. Because I do think there is a lot of freedom. And here's how, in reading it again, my analysis has shifted deeper into Oedipus's character that I think is really much more, the way it's been talked about in literary analysis is he's the ideal Athenian leader in many ways of that time. And what they mean, what's meant by that, but I think there's a lot of virtue in him, just generally, not just with what Athens thought. He is he's a thinker and an actor. So there's moments when he says, I've thought about this. I've done these types of thinking, and I've sent, when he's talking to the chorus at the beginning, he says, yes, you have this problem, and I've already been thinking about it. I've already taken the action that you need, right? They call on him to cure them. He's said to be, there's a doctor element, and he's already done the action, right? That's what a good leader should do. He should think about it and he should act, right? He's described as a good oarsman, a steersman of the state. And there's this, and he's a good investigator. He asks questions. He's like, well, what about this? And there's certain ways so these are things that Athens at this time, which is the birth of reason and thought, essentially, in a I guess more specific philosophical way and in a methodological way. And he kind of represents that. And what I've seen in the story is that driving force is what leads to his inevitable downfall. So it's the virtues, that he takes in his actions that he pushes, because there's even a moment when Jocasta's like, essentially, dude, stop thinking about this, stop investigating, like just stop. She starts getting worried and she's like, stop, like you don't want to go down this avenue. She's getting this sinking feeling. And she's like, something's wrong in the state of Denmark. Something's rotten in the state of Denmark. I don't want to know about it. You shouldn't want to know about it. Ignorance is bliss. Let's just live by chance. Whatever happens, happens. But he cannot drop it. He has to know the truth. Yeah. And so he pushes it forward. And that's, again, what leads to this horrific outcome, which you've already described, where Jocasta kills herself. He blinds himself. And then he asks to be, and in that, I would say that there's a really wonderful line in the Fagel's translation that I have, where he says, Apollo decreed my fate, but it was I who poked out my eyes. It was he says, it was my hand. And he's the stressing of the action of like, yes, there are these horrible fates, these strong elements outside of our control, but within that, there is something that we have control over. I have control over my own punishment.
And Oedipus refuses to cease the investigation, and he refuses to kill himself. Jocasta, you could plausibly argue that Jocasta takes the easy way out, and Oedipus doesn't. He's going to remain alive. There's the, what you might say, the objective horror of what has happened, but he faces that. And this is incidentally, your interpretation is shared by Friedrich Nietzsche, who in The Birth of Tragedy, when he's talking about Oedipus, he makes the same point, that what makes Oedipus really work is that he refuses to ignore the truth. And when the true horror of reality is thrust upon him, he makes a good end of it. And I think this is what we could call the tragic sense of life, is that this notion that there are times, and some dramatists would say this is all the time, when there is no escape, there is no way to succeed, and it's sort of a question of how you make the best end under the circumstances. An example that comes immediately to mind would be the Pennsylvania plane on September 11th, right? There's no way that you're going to regain control of the airplane. Even if you do regain control of the airplane, nobody on board knows how to land it. And so everybody on this plane is going to die. There's nothing you can do about that. So under those circumstances, what do you do to make the best end of it? Do you choose something cowardly, or do you choose something noble and good? And of course, we all know that in that specific case, they chose something noble and good. And I think what makes the tragedy work is the very fact that Oedipus is a virtuous character, that he is a driven and thoughtful and conscientious about his duties as king. And I think Edith Hamilton makes this point actually in her classic book, The Greek Way, that what makes the tragedy successful is that Oedipus is an admirable person. So the hasty idea that, well, he's punished for his wrongdoing, no, the play wouldn't work if it were that way.
Yeah, I think, and this goes back to the power that it holds to the Greek audience and to ourselves, knowing already what's going to happen to Oedipus. And the question is, as you pointed out earlier, what will Sophocles do with this material? And I think what he makes it about is the revelations that happen. And there's a series of these revelations. And, as we've pointed out, they're pushed forward, all the actions pushed forward by his virtues of action, of doing the right thing and wanting to know, and those types of things. So I think there's an element where that is the important thing for us in reading it today, understanding that artifice. And part of what I guess I try to do with my magazine, Troubadour magazine, is help people get more out of this for their own sake for today. And so I think we can get into what relevance it has to our own lives. And we've touched on this, but maybe getting into it specifically. So, I try to mention some things about some political angles that are relevant. And you've talked about this with, also the weariness of kings. And we could see this with tyrants that are relevant today. The more power somebody has, the more they're weary of people around them just aiming and angling for them and trying to, get their power essentially. And, so the other way that I've looked at it is, what type of control do we actually believe we have? So when we look at Oedipus, we could say, this is what the Greeks believed. They believed in this fatalism world. And within that realm, you could have it, and so I guess we can ask ourselves, do we believe in that? Do we believe that we have free will and that we actually can challenge ourselves? And I don't know if there's some relevance that you have in terms of our own.
Well, I think this is what led me to my thoughts about giving up your body and living in your mind. Because what speaks to me about the play anyway, and more so, I feel funny saying this, but more so as I get older. I'm only in my early 40s, but it has occurred to me now that I'm twice as old as I was when I first read the play, that this quality of mortality, there is one sense in which life is a no-win game, because eventually we all are going to die and there's nothing you can do to escape that. And so to some extent, life is about making a beautiful or meaningful experience while you're here and while you have the opportunity to make choices, to make good choices. And of course, this was very much on the Greeks' minds. There's a famous legend about the meeting between Solon and Croesus. Solon was supposed to be the wisest man in Athens, and he spent some time traveling the world. And according to Herodotus, he had a meeting with Croesus, who was the richest man in the world. And Croesus brought in all of his gold and jewelry and showed them all to Solon and said, "Who do you think is the happiest man in the world?" Of course, anticipating that Solon would say, "Why, you, Croesus, you're the happiest man because you're so rich." Yeah. But instead, what Solon said was he told a story about an old lady he knew who had lived really well, had two sons who grew up to be good men who fought well in a war. And when she died, they did funeral honors for her the way that they were supposed to. And he said she was the happiest person because, she had lived a good life that was satisfying, fulfilling, and met all of the requirements of the gods. And there you go. Well, I think that comes to mind with Oedipus because Oedipus is, in one sense, you could find something of that in every life, that we're all sentenced to ultimate destruction. So do we face reality and try to do what's right, even when it seems sometimes like it's pointless? Or do we take the route that Jocasta counsels, where she says, "Close your eyes and pretend that it's different, and fantasize and live in bliss"? Or or do you take the cowardly route and like Jocasta does, or what? And I think that the reason why this play speaks to me in modern times, even though I do not believe that our fates are decreed by the gods, is that it speaks to this idea of, even when success is not possible, still beauty and a meaningful life are possible. I think that's a really important message that the Greeks really hand to us.
Yeah, so there's this element where, how did you put it? So the free will aspect, it just escaped my mind, what you were saying a second ago.
You see my brilliance just
yeah, no, it was
it
was good. It was something about the way that we approach fatalism in the realms that we have room and control over. And I had a thought that had just slipped my mind, so I'll have to skip into okay. Sorry, I do remember now. And this, I think, goes into what you were talking about is so important for us in remembering what meaning is, and how what we do have room to make meaning out of our lives. And so the story of Oedipus, as I kind of told it at the very beginning of our podcast here, is well known to everybody. The play takes place essentially at the end of his life, right? Or the end of his, or sorry, not the end of his life, the end of his, this moment of him revealing all this information. All the action of his life is a memory. And there are moments in the play when he thinks back to his life, when he goes to the crossroads and he re-evaluates that scene. And in a sense, he now re-evaluates it with meaning in mind. Now that or with knowledge. And that, in a sense, is what meaning is. And it's what, there's this idea of like creating yourself, but also coming from self-discovery by introspecting and going back into the past. And I think the Greeks had a really good insight into that psychological process, that self-creation and meaning comes from looking at your past with new insights. You were talking about...
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're talking about...
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Oh, so you were talking about, you're 40 now and you can look back at your life and not only reinterpret at Oedipus, but you probably are reinterpreting your life as it was led and how it led you to here, which gives you a sense of yourself. And that's where meaning comes from, in my view. There's a lot of people who talk about meaning from God or meaning from these other areas. I think the Greeks at least had an inkling that, yes, there's fatal, their view is there's fate. There's a lot of it where you don't have any control in their view, but a lot, there's something about looking into your past and reevaluating it and reliving it. I mean, the scene where Oedipus describes the approach at the crossroads. If you read the language, and now I don't read Greek, so I have to rely on the translations. But from what I understand, Fagles did a phenomenal job with this, in that it starts to become first person action as he's telling the story. So he's telling the story of something that happened 20 years or 15 years earlier, whenever the action happens, but it starts to become, and I hit him, I cudgeled him. And I think that, memory becomes real. It becomes now. And this is, I run something called the Literary Canon Club at Troubadour Magazine, where a bunch of people who go through and read the literary canon together, essentially. And one of the things that I'm always confronted with is like, well, what's the purpose of reading literature? Like, what does it really give us? And I think this is a perfect example of, it gives you the insight of our lives are, in a sense, or they can be easily chaotic. We can easily have a disordered, unmeaningful life that is probably if you just live life without contemplation, that's essentially what you're living. To have meaning, to have order is an active process that you yourself have control over. And for me, that when reading Oedipus Rex again, I really saw that truth in Sophocles, that philosophical.
That's marvelous. That had not occurred to me, and you're absolutely right that this is particularly a Greek insight. So in her book, The Morality of Happiness, the philosopher Julia Annis starts out by saying when the Greeks thought of philosophy, they thought of it in just this way. She says, you've lived, say, 30 or 40 years, and now you pause to kind of take stock of your life as sort of a trajectory through the universe and make sense of it. What have you done well? What have you not done well? What can you improve on in the remaining years of your life, and so forth? And it's a marvelous point that Annis makes that, the Greeks really thought of philosophy very differently than a lot of people do nowadays. The Greek philosophy is along the lines of what would nowadays be categorized as self-help books a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And you find this tradition of looking back on your life from an experience of 30 years or so. You even find it in Dante, right? The opening passage of the Inferno is Dante is walking through a wood, and he specifies at the age of 33, and he pauses and at a crossroads. And I think that is sort of a hint at this idea. Incidentally, so you were talking about the passage where Oedipus does this, and he reflects back on the killing of Laius. Now we've got the Fagles translation here.
Yeah.
Fagles, by the way, is not, your real Greek nerds are not real fond of Robert Fagles because he's not very literal. I prefer Fagles of all the translators because I think it's good to not be too literal, because Greek and English are just too different. You can't really convey it by literally translating it. So I prefer Fagles. But if you get the Fagles version, this is
just if we could touch on that real quick, and then you could read your thing. Just one thing about that with the language that I think is powerful is just the name Oedipus, which this play in particular has a lot of puns in it in the Greek that don't translate at all. Like Oedipus, depending on how it's spelled and the accent or how it's pronounced or whatever, means lame-footed, but it also means to know in Greek. And so there's a lot of, there's moments when he says, I this, and it's like, and it would be like Oedipus and Oedipus, the pun is that he doesn't know that he's sleeping with his wife, right? And it's the Tiresias telling him, that you're you're sleeping with, like, don't you know? And in the Greek it would be Oedipus, and so you can't translate that, and we lose so much of that. But anyway,
totally.
I just wanted
in addition to which, like Lattimore, for instance, he'll even translate names differently, like spelling them with a K instead of a C and stuff. And he, in his view, that gives it an authenticity. To me, it separates us from the play. We're so accustomed to seeing a name like Achilles or something spelled in a particular way that reading it that way, it alienates it from us, and so we see it more as an object rather than experiencing the play the way it was intended. So I prefer Fagles myself.
Yeah,
but here's the passage
Go ahead.
that you're talking about. It's on pages 205 and 206. And he switches when he's describing the encounter on the road with Laius. He switches from past tense to present tense. On page 206, I began to see a herald and then a brace of colts drawing a wagon, and mounted on the bench a man, just as you've described him, coming face to face. And the one in the lead and the old man himself were about to thrust me off the road, brute force. And the one shouldering me aside, the driver, I strike him in anger. See, he switches to present tense. Yeah. And the old man watching me coming up along his wheels, he brings down his prod, 2 prongs straight at my head. I paid him back with earnest, short work, by God. With one blow of the staff in his right hand, I knock him out of his high seat, and so forth. Yeah, and he ends, by the way, with a pun. I killed them all, every mother's son, right? Yeah. That pun that you were just talking about. Now, a lot of people, and I remember this again from high school, a lot of people, this is one of the scenes that they latch onto as being the tragic flaw. Well, Oedipus is killed for having murdered Laius. And I think it's pretty clearly not what was intended by Sophocles here. Sophocles although, today we would consider this road rage incident to be excessive. I think in Sophocles' audience would have seen this as adequate provocation, and they would not have thought that Oedipus is in some sense blameworthy of murder here. And it certainly is. That idea is never hinted at in any of the mythology or any of the other plays or by Aristotle. So I don't think that's an accurate reading. It's something, though, that I know a lot of first timers run into.
Yeah. And
incidentally, talking about first timers, I'm reminded of an incident. This was about 10 years ago or so. I actually got to see not the Oedipus plays, but the Orestia performed live on stage in Greek. And it was purely by accident. What happened was I found out that a company was putting on all three plays at a theater in San Jose, California, which was not too far from where I was living at the time. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of neat. I should go do this. So I bought a ticket. I went down to see it. And before the play started, there was this little reception where people are passing around hors d'oeuvres and things. And I'm standing there, and they were fantastic hors d'oeuvres. I love Greek food. And these hors d'oeuvres are all the Greek stuff. And it's just fantastic. And everybody's standing around speaking Greek. And only at that point did it occur to me that maybe the play wouldn't be in English. So we all go into the theater, and sure enough, the entire thing was in Greek. Now, fortunately, they had one of those silent radios or whatever they call it up above the stage, translating it into English as it went. And of course, I'd read the plays, so I knew what happens.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic. It was the most incredible thing to see this play performed. It was put on by a company led by a man named Leonidas Leozides. It's Loizedes, and he was still performing. Nowadays, all the theaters are shut down for now, but he was still putting on these performances of ancient Greek literature in Greek in New York and across the country until very recently. So if your audience is really into this, I strongly recommend looking up Leonidas Leozides and seeing if you can find one of these performances on stage, because it's really fascinating to see something like this enacted as authentically as you can really get it in the 21st century.
Yeah, I'll try to, I will put a link in the show notes for that. I have not heard of that. I do remember many years ago seeing one Greek play that I don't even remember it. It didn't make much sense to me. It was actually at the Getty Villa in.
Oh yes, they put on the performances in their little theater there. Theater. I've always wanted to see one and never managed to.
Yeah, I mean, it could have just been like the time of my life or something. I just don't remember much. I think it was a Euripides play. I just don't remember much of it. It didn't make any sense to me, and I had read Greek, and it might have just been the performance, or it might have been me. I don't know. It's hard to say because sometimes. So that's the only Greek play I've ever seen, but there are times when it becomes challenging because modern playwrights or theater managers and directors want to modernize it. Oh, yeah. And my view of a lot of these classics is that they're modern enough in a certain sense. I mean, this play in particular is an example, but not all of them. I guess it would, someone could argue not all of them, but this play in particular, I think could easily be, just performed as it is. And I think it would be wonderful to see it in the Greek, especially if you had some kind of translation. I mean, a lot of, now they could even do it like with a phone. I mean, they could do apps or something like that. We do have new technology that could make it really cool where you can kind of see, the text coming on or something like that. That's going along with the words that they're saying. And
there are some movie versions of Oedipus. I think there are 3 in English that I know of. There's one that's pretty easy to find on Netflix, I think, in black and white, and it's done with masks as the original play would have been done.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But there's a more recent one done in the 80s starring John Gielgud as Tiresias and a lot of other very famous actors from Great Britain. It was done by BBC in, I think it was 86 or 87. And you can find it on YouTube, and it's not great video quality, but you can watch the whole thing. And it's modernized, like you say. It's done in modern dress, and the language has been made so that people can more easily follow what's going along. But for a beginner, it's a very good way of getting into to start out with, follow how the play is supposed to operate in the full horror of Oedipus's experience.
Yeah, and so with the going back to what we can glean from it today, when I, again, rereading it, I was struck by the emphasis on the plague and the destruction of the city. As as we're recording this, we're still in a pandemic. And, the question of solving that problem and how we solve that problem and what methods we use as a society to solve the problem. Obviously, the Greeks had a different view, but I think one of the things that, going back to the character of Oedipus as even though Oedipus takes place in Thebes thousands of years before the Athenians, he represented what the Athenians thought were great virtues. Or maybe not that, he was, I don't know his exact time historically, but long before Athens, classical Athens. And, so when I was looking at this and I was thinking how we today are solving this problem of dealing with this plague that we have today versus then. And again, this is just me trying to figure out if there's any corollaries. And, so one of the things is like I said earlier, the virtues of Oedipus are also described in the language in a variety of ways. So, I talked about thoughtfulness and action and, how he's an investigator. But some of the other things that is kind of built into the language are the proud achievements of classical Athens. Things like mathematics, right? The reasoning, a logical approach to something. Like that is not something you get prior to this very often in the ancient world, where people are really, and there's, they're proud of their agriculture. So Oedipus is described as, in certain cases, like plowing in the case of Jocasta, of course, but he's used this language about him constantly, and there seems to be built into the play a criticism of that in opposition to the oracle, which has the truth. So this is the birth of humanism. Can the human world solve these problems? And or must we rely on the oracle? And there's a line in there by the chorus, which represents the Theban people, it represents conservatism, where they say the oracle has to be proved right, even if it's wrong, essentially. Because we have to rely on that for the truth. And, I sometimes think about how we today, rely on things for knowledge. And, we don't want to question the challenging things. We don't want to question our pinnacles of truth. Whether you're on the right, if you're on the right, it could be these news stations. If you're on the left, it's those news stations, whatever it is, or it's, academia, whatever your column of truth comes from. I just found it very universal, that question of do we have to rely on these kind of supernatural? I mean, they put it in very supernatural terms, but I think it can be applied to other types of oracles. And like I mentioned, the economists. And so I don't know if you see that or if that's too much of a stretch. I can see where you're going
with that. And I think I can see how that connects with the way I was interpreting the play too. Because if I'm right that this play is ultimately about, I guess you could say, being grounded, right, as recognizing your mortality and keeping in mind that you are a union of mind and body and not these separate entities. I can see how, if that's correct, how Sophocles would have connected that to this idea about, can we as humans cut ourselves free of the oracles and the gods for which they speak? Would we be safe in a world in which we trusted solely in human judgment? Mm-hmm. And I said earlier that I'm somewhat skeptical of the idea that Sophocles is a religious conservative, but on this point, I think he certainly would be a religious conservative, and that he would say, his answer, I think, in this play is no, that we can't cut ourselves off entirely, because, then if we cut ourselves loose of the inherited taboos and traditions and the religion of our fathers, you might say, that we are at sea and we will have nothing to guide us and we'll come to ruin. I suspect that is what his answer to that would be. And I can see literarily how that would also connect to the incest theme of the play. Because I think what Sophocles would have said is that the long-standing taboo against incest is handed to us by the gods, because of course the gods engage in incest all the time. It's where they come from, basically. But that's not okay for humans because we are mere mortals. And I think he would have said there's sort of this hierarchy, and that incest is a literary device in the play to kind of indicate transgressing those boundaries and cutting ourselves free of what Sophocles would have said are the religiously grounded morals of the city. And you and I coming to the play as more humanists, as people who reject that perspective on philosophy, we have a different view of it. We see that as I guess, parochial in a way that Sophocles would not have. But and that gives us, I guess, a different insight into the play. We look at the play and we see it from a very different angle because of that. And so we see the religious grounding and the taboos and the superstitions as being sort of holding the society back from what it might otherwise have accomplished, whereas Sophocles would have seen it as the essential anchor that keeps the ship of state from floating away entirely. And the plague thing, of course, obviously the plague was a longstanding literary device to indicate the god's displeasure. Mm-hmm. But it's also true that real life plagues, as we've learned in the past year, real life plagues really do arise in part from a failure to take precautions. Now, they would not have thought of it that way. And Sophocles, I don't think, would have really thought of it that way for the most part. They probably had a loose idea that, you don't drink out of the dirty water or something like that. But it's very rudimentary by our standards, obviously. So when you and I look at the play and we look at the use of the plague device in the plot, we see something very different. We see it as a failure to prepare, a failure of foresight, which kind of collides with Sophocles' characterization of Oedipus as a character who does take precautions, is conscientious as a leader, and so forth. But I don't think that's necessarily a contradiction in how we read the play. I think that Sophocles would say that indeed Oedipus has failed to take precautions. It's just that he didn't realize it because he was so busy trying to take precautions. That's just the paradox, the horrible paradox that Oedipus is in, is he's tried his best to prevent bad things from happening, whether it be a sin or whatever. And the fates have just decreed otherwise. Apollo has just decreed other. Now, there has been a tradition historically. There's been sort of this dispute in scholarship in interpreting Oedipus of people who are really bothered by the idea that Oedipus is just sort of a puppet on a string, and who have tried to argue around that. There's a famous classicist named Dodds who wrote an essay on this called On Misreading the Oedipus Rex, where he tried to argue that the gods predict the future, but they don't control it. They're more like the weatherman who says it's going to rain on Sunday, who's not really causing it to rain on Sunday. But and I'll have something to say about this in the objective standard soon. That view seems pretty misguided. When you look at the text, there really is no way of arguing that Oedipus is anything other than controlled by the dictate of the god Apollo, who is punishing his father, and it just so happens that Oedipus suffers an injustice as a result. And this idea that there's something inconsistent in that with religion, I think, is also anachronistic. The Greeks, at least, and this is very different from our Judeo-Christian perspective of our society, the Greeks had no compunction about saying that the gods committed injustice. Mm-hmm. In the Prometheus Bound, for instance, the very last line of the Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus is Prometheus saying, "I have been treated unjustly by Zeus." So the Greeks had no compunction about saying the gods sometimes, well,
that's one of the things I think that made them great to some degree, is that you can't, if you look at other religions, you can't you can't draw Muhammad without you'll get executed. And this is true of Christianity at certain periods. And what that does is that essentially blocks off the ability to think about gods at all and their relevance to our, and the Greeks, and you mentioned Edith Hamilton, she said that they were the first ones to really create all the gods in their own image with their own foibles and things that were very human-like, which gives you an ability to kind of put them into a relationship between you which rather than demoting you as a human, as a creature on this planet, it elevates you to say that, we come from, Hercules comes from Zeus, and I'm a descendant of Hercules, or I'm a descendant of this person or of this god or of that.
And if any of your listeners have not read Hamilton's The Greek Way, you absolutely must.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
It's just a marvelous book. I mean, you can quibble about some of the details about her interpretations of Greek culture and whatnot, and that argument's been going on for centuries. But Hamilton is, first of all, she's such a fine writer, very elegant writing, and her perspective on the Greeks is just just marvelous. And you're right. She says, for instance, the Greeks, unlike other religions, the Greek gods do not create the universe. The universe exists prior to the gods. There's chaos first, and then the gods come about, and they have genealogies, and they act like, an occupying force in some ways, right? They're like this alien tribe that kind of controls us, and we have to do what they want, but they are not real. They're not in this for our good by any means.
Yeah. And so I think one thing we can maybe close out with that I think is important, I like to try to talk about, is the role, how art plays a role in our lives and why this is important. And you kind of touched on some things in just a few moments ago with when you were talking about how Sophocles had these views of religion, and he would land on the side of the oracles, that we need the oracles. This is when I was talking about can we question the oracles? What are their relevance to today? But to some degree, he had his opinion. It's in the text. Part of our job is to interpret the text and then to say yay or nay, in a sense, right? And to really contemplate the text. That's how I see the role of literature as art form, or really any art form. But it's that it's not about agreeing with Sophocles. Right. I think that's one of the mistakes people make, especially when reading older texts, is that you have to agree with them or something. Like, that's the feeling you get. And no, you're not going to agree with most of these texts in their fundamental conclusions. But one, that doesn't mean they don't have truth in them, right? Like the challenges of leadership, like you were talking about, being a good person, trying to take action. And Sophocles has this view that that's going to lead to your inevitable downfall, that all these humanistic things, if we don't rely on religion, it's going to lead to our downfall. I think that's his essential, final conclusion. That's what we can look at and be like, well, I don't agree with that, but I can see where the logic of where he's coming from. And that gives me material to understand that concept. And really, the last thing is understanding the philosophical discussion of fate and free will. It's really easy. You mentioned like getting lost in your head, and anybody who's ever read philosophy, which I've only read a little bit, I'm not a philosopher by any stretch, but it's really easy to get lost in your head. I mean, I don't know how many determinism talks I've had with intellectual, philosophers or people interested in fate, free will, and determinism. And it's just, stringing along of concepts and ideas that you drag from different people, when it's best encapsulated in great works of literature. Oedipus is a good one to talk about. Should he take Jocasta's advice? Should he keep pushing? If he stops pushing, will the fate come about still if he stopped doing it? But then would he be Oedipus, and would he be the leader? Like, then all the plague is going to wipe everybody out if he doesn't do that, right? And then in a sense, he does kill his wife or his he sleeps with his mother and kills his father. Anyway, like that never changed, so on and so forth. You can contemplate it. And, I just think that the Greeks really understood that as a role of life, which is why this was a religious event, when they put on a play with 14 to 15,000 people watching it in a whole day. Like, it was your duty, in a sense, as a citizen, especially if you were going to vote. Like, you had to be a thinker if you had the right to vote, and you had to be able to contemplate these things. And I think I don't think of it as that's our duty as American citizens, really, but it's our duty as humans to ourselves to live our best lives, to take the time to read these works of art and understand them, and contemplate them.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, literature, whatever the literature, if it's good quality, serves as often as a sort of a thought experiment of what would you do in these kind of circumstances and why, and what do you think of the characters and how they do them. And that's sort of that second step you were talking about. Our first step is it a well done work of art just on its own terms? Does it accomplish what was intended to accomplish? And then you say, and what do I think of it? I could very well read it and say this is a masterpiece work of literature, but I can't stand it. In fact, there are a number of works that I feel that way about.
Yeah.
Because the evaluation of it as a work of art is kind of separate from how we evaluate it in terms of moral and philosophical values. So, and as you said about criticizing or questioning the relationship between the gods and the city and so forth, we also see that in other works of Sophocles, like the Antigone, about what is the relationship between the requirements of the political state of the law on one hand, and our duties to obey morality or the will of the gods on the other. And Sophocles in that play takes a much more, you might say, rebellious tone. And in fact, this is my own little interpretation. I don't know whether any scholar agrees with me, but I think the Antigone is actually Sophocles criticizing the people of Athens. The chorus in that play that stands in for the people of the city, I think Sophocles is kind of implicitly criticizing the audience by having them be the chorus, which is a really interesting device to use. So when you approach the play with that in mind, I think it teaches you a different lesson than if you approach it from a different direction. So I do think that in the end, I do agree that Sophocles is a moderately religious conservative in that sense, but he's got a real undercurrent, you might say, of political rebelliousness about him that makes him a really interesting writer.
Yes, and so even if you're not a literature person or interested in literature, go read Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King. We'll put a link to the version that both of us, I think, recommend by Robert.
And it's really
Fagles.
short. A lot of people don't know how realize how short these Greek tragedies are.
The introduction is just as long, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and you can read all three of them in a day or two.
Yeah, and I think it's 62 pages for the Antigone or something like that. It's like,
right.
and it's not thick text the whole time. So I agree. I think it's important that people understand it's not that long. And just so everybody knows, I do something called, again, go to troubadourmag.com/literary canon club. If you want to join us, we're going from the Iliad to Gatsby. We're reading all of it. You don't have to be with us the entire time. You could just join us for session 1 or 2 or whatever you want to go through. But check that out. Sign up. It's free to sign up. And we can talk about all the resources and the ways that we help you read through this canon, because it is a valuable insight. And now, Tim, you have a review coming up in the magazine, The Objective Standard. And I think the URL is simply, is it theobjectivestandard.com?
Yes.
Or is it, okay, so it's theobjectivestandard.com. So go to that website, and you have a lot of articles with them, but when is this new, it's a review of a new translation, right? Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I've been writing monthly book reviews for them, and my March review is on a new translation of the Oedipus Rex by a University of Virginia classicist named Kovacs, and I try to look at it a little bit and see what it says in its introduction and its analysis of some of these philosophical questions that we've been talking about, and also compare it to some of the other translations that we've seen. Because, like we said at the very beginning of this podcast, a more literal translation versus a more poetic translation, they each have their upsides and downsides. And Kovacs is trying a verse translation. So he's translating it into, not all iambic pentameter, but into an English verse form to try and convey some of that elevated quality that is in the original Greek. Like you, I don't know ancient Greek. I actually took 3 semesters of ancient Greek in college, which was hell on earth because it's a damn hard language, but it's but it just gave me enough to be a difficulty to my friends and others. But anyway, this is a new translation that's just come out, and comparing it to Fagles and the other translators. My favorite still is Fagles. By the way, you said you're reading the Iliad. Are you doing the Fagles translation of the Iliad?
No, we're doing Evie Ryu, actually.
I don't think I'm familiar that one.
Yeah, he's the one that he wrote, or that translation is essentially what launched Penguin Classic Books back in the 40s. And it reached millions of people back then. It's a prose translation. It was recommended in a lecture. It was recommended in a lecture by Dr. Leonard Peikoff. It's what he recommends. And for people joining the Literary Canon Club, a lot of them are not necessarily literary people, and or at least not in terms of the background. So I wanted to start them off with something like this because I think it's a very it's kind of like this, the Fagles translation in terms of prose for that for the Iliad, but it's very descriptive. I think it keeps a lot of the essence of the language alive, but translated into the metaphors and the ways
that's
that
one of the
people
kind of look down sometimes on prose translations, but they're very good for that reason because they can convey the full beauty of the original content without feeling bound to English language prose or English language prosody that would make it difficult for them to express those ideas. So that's not a bad idea at all.
Yeah, and I'll just say that you do have to be careful with translations. There was one I was looking at, because Beowulf is one we're going to read in the future, of course, and there's a new translation or come out not too long ago, and it started off like, bro, this is, and I was like, wait a second. It literally starts off with like, and they're trying to make it like this modern. I'm like, come on.
I know just the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, like I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I get that. But part of the reason, like these stories are powerful, but there is something innate in the language and the elevating aspect where it's not colloquial, right? This language is explicitly not colloquial. It's supposed to separate you to some degree to enter the world of these. And the Iliad that I'm reading, and we're also going to do, I think it's Fagles Aeneid. I think he did Aeneid. I could be wrong, but yeah. So I have a list of the translations we're going through. But anyway, if you don't have that elevation, especially in these older works where that's what the authors were trying to go for, is these well-told stories. They put them, that are well-known stories. They put them into beautiful verse. And I think it is ancient Greek. If you just listen to a recording of it, of the beginning of the Iliad in ancient Greek, you could hear it. It's very beautiful. It's rhythmic. It's got this rocking nature. And you can't get that in the English, but you can, like you said, elevate and you can have this, you could just have better prose that captures the essence of that meaning, or the meaning behind that verse that we can't capture in English. It was just too different.
It's a real shame that there's, there's been in the news lately, this, canceling the classics.
Disrupt text.
And it's such a shame because we're talking about the fundamental literature of Western culture that has survived and interested people so long precisely because they speak to people across cultural boundaries. That's precisely why they have prevailed in history. And to then neglect them out of this preconception that they can't possibly speak to me because I have a different race or sexual identity or whatever it might be is such a shame. And it really deprives people of an opportunity to join with other great minds throughout history that have also read these works and to appreciate it the same way they do. That connects you with people past generations that have also sat down and read the Iliad or read the Oedipus Rex. And, you really have a sort of cross-generation republic of letters, you might say, which is really rewarding, refreshing feeling. And it's a shame that people are denied that. So it's really good that you're encouraging people to read these works like this.
Well, the Disrupt Text movement is why I finally launched the Literary Canon Club. It's something I've wanted to do. But again, it was just like, how can I make this work? But I think now there's, I'm trying to make the Literary Canon Club essentially a movement, like an anti-disrupt text type movement, because just so people understand, the disrupt text movement is not just a couple of random people saying, I don't like these texts, let's stop reading them. These are teachers who are successfully, from K through 12 and college, successfully removing these texts, not just the Iliad and the Odyssey, although they have, like they'll send out tweets. Oh, I just removed the Odyssey from our curriculum at school. Yay. And then they're applauded for removing the Odyssey. Like that's their achievement. It's like, wait a second. That's so weird. You are proud of the fact that people are not going to be reading this text, which has shaped, whether you hate or if you hate Western civilization, you should definitely understand what it's about first. And
it reminds me of an old
this.
There was an old Dadaist sculpture in the 1920s, I think it was, which consisted of a machine that when you flip the switch, a little hand came out of the machine and turned the switch off. The whole point of the machine, the only thing the machine did was turn itself off. Okay. And there's something so deeply nihilistic about that. That's what I think of these teachers and professors who are like, we shouldn't teach the great works of literature and history. It's a real shame. Well,
Harold Bloom called this the literary critic. I don't know how familiar if you are. He called it the school of resentment, and he talked about this in the 90s. And of course, this goes back really to the beginning of modernism, I think, and then especially postmodernism. But I definitely think the school of resentment, like, the writers who write within this, who agree with this, are essentially saying that, they don't want to be compared to Dante and Shakespeare. And I write fiction. I get it. By the way, I do understand that feeling. Like, I'm never going to live up to Hawthorne I love Hawthorne. I'm not going to live up to Hawthorne, even though like so many of my stories are directly inspired by him. They're not even in the same ballpark, or like Melville is another one that I really like. And I'm never going to write on that level, I don't think. But I always, one of the great things about the canon is that it's always the measurement. It's always the North Star that you're striving for. Modern writers, I think, do not want that. They want to cut that off and say, okay, so this is the canon now. This is our great works now. Forget what happened for 5,000 years or 3,000 years before this. Let's start with 1960. That's when it all starts. That's when the universe starts.
And it makes that it like might that, be maybe that would be okay if they didn't produce such boring crap. Whereas,
well, that's why they produce boring crap.
The Iliad and the Odyssey and Oedipus Rex. I mean, it's got incest. It's got people plucking their eyes out. It's got sword fights, and this is exciting literature. This is not boring, people made out of marble kind of stuff. And I think it does suffer from that reputation. People think about classicism and the classics as being somehow pompous. But when you actually get into it, these are war stories. These are stories with romance, and like the scene in the Iliad where Hector scares his child when he puts on the helmet. So he has to take the helmet off. It's such a beautiful and moving passage, and people who don't know this literature, they're deprived of it. It's a real shame.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the movement. So Troubadour Talks is about that as well. It's trying to get people engaged with the people from all walks of life. So I don't want it to be just for this quote unquote literary elite, which I think gives it that kind of sense that you're talking about, where it seems hoity-toity. It seems removed, and I'm always trying to bring it back to our lives. So I'll let you have, the last word. Any last words on Oedipus or art or anything like that, before we sign off?
Oh, that's always a dangerous invitation to give to a lawyer. How much time do I have, Your Honor? No, I thank you very much for having me on. And again, I just encourage everybody to get into the classics and see how much they can enrich your life and your appreciation. Not just, by the way, this is another interesting point, is that it's not just the works themselves, but how much else you can appreciate by appreciating this. Because, of course, these works have inspired other works. And to understand those, you have to understand where they come from. A good example of this is the Antigone. Sophocles writes the Antigone in, 300 BC or whatever it was. Well, after World War II, the French playwright Jean Anouilh wrote his own version of Antigone that's sort of a reflection on the original in terms of 20th century totalitarianism. And to really appreciate the point he's getting at, you, of course, have to be familiar with the original. Well, so much of our art and literature comes from the classics that people really should get to know it just in order to appreciate that,
Great message. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Yeah. And you're welcome back anytime for the Orestia, by the way, if you want to come on.
Oh, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'd love that. All right. Thank you, everybody.